Okay.
This is Channel 2. Okay. Good afternoon, friends and newcomers to our Friday special conversations with special people. I'm so happy to introduce our very special guest and friends today, Karen Gevirtz. She's an author, a great author, and professor of English at Seton Hall University. And Karen first spoke here on October 10th, 2002. On her book, she put mercury in the morning milk, Women Criminals in the 18th Century. So throughout the years, she has spoken on such a wide variety of subjects: American film satire, Langston Hughes and Paul Simon, funny women, and last year, MD, Moms and Meds, the birth of Big Pharma. Today's topic will be echoes of the past in the current pandemic. She is so talented and has donated so much of her time to our group, and I really appreciate it so much. Karen, everyone has learned so much from you, so thank you.
Thank you.
So now I won't waste any more time because I want to hear all about this topic. So please, let's give a very warm welcome to our special guest and friend, Karen Gevirtz.
Thank you. I'm going to, Phyllis, I always say after you introduce me that I really wish that my mother could hear you. And so I'm very happy to say that my mother can hear you. So I'm really
So happy. I would have added more because you're so
No, I'm really thrilled. So thank you.
I wanted to you
So
also.
I just want to say a huge thank you to Phyllis and to Michael for making this possible. And Phyllis, always a thank you for inviting me. It's this is one of my favorite things to do. I love speaking to this audience. I'm thrilled you guys are on. Thank you so much. And I should say that that I road test my books with you guys. So you, if you go back and you look at the books that I've published, you'll notice that parts of them are lectures that you've heard, and today and last year on Moms, Meds, and Big Pharma was no exception. So you're going to be hearing sort of a preview of the book that I'm writing right now. So so I'm really looking forward to the Q&A, as I always am. So echoes of the past and the current pandemic is really a question of what have we inherited that makes us deal with things in the way that we're dealing with them now in terms of the pandemic. So I'm going to talk in three sections. The first part of this talk is I'm calling Making Sense of the Situation. We're creating our story, which is how do we make sense of this almost unimaginable thing that's happening with the pandemic. And then in the second part, I'm going to get a little more focused and talk about the origins of the non-existent public health infrastructure. And I really do mean it in that rather paradoxical way. So why is it that the United States has the public health infrastructure and also the attitudes towards public health that we have? Where did they come from? And what are we doing with them now? And then the last section is why is medication more like tea and less like water? And I am not going to tell you what I mean by that. So you're just going to have to wait for part 3. So if you're thinking of tuning out, don't tune out. You're going to want to find out why medication is more like tea and less than like water. So let me get started. Part 1, making sense of the situation. And for a really uplifting start to the day, let's talk about the plague, shall we? So plague has been around for thousands and thousands of years. Westerners and Easterners have been dealing with diseases that have struck as plague for millennia. And so we are not in an exceptional position. And if you notice, the current environment is very aware of the fact that we have inherited legacies from the past. And so these are just some headlines that I've taken from recent publications. NPR is on here, there's The Guardian, scientific publications. So we're very aware that the way we've talked about plagues in the past, epidemics in the past, may have something to tell us about what's going on now. So I'm going to show you a little bit of what that really means. So I'm going to start with a plague that's not particularly famous, which is the plague in Athens during the Second Peloponnesian War in 429 through 426 BCE. And I don't know if there are any Thucydides fans in the crowd, but he was a really amazing person. And he not only lived through the plague in Athens, but he actually survived it. He had a round of the plague. And we have his amazing account of the plague from his account of the Second Peloponnesian War. So I'm going to give you some passages, and I think you'll find them really surprisingly pertinent. Right, so he begins by talking about how the plague came to Athens. And the first thing I want to call your attention to is that there's no previous record of so great a pestilence and destruction of human life. This should ring a bell, right? This is something that we really haven't seen in this way before. The doctors were unable to cope since they were treating the disease for the first time and in ignorance. So here we see him from the very beginning setting out how amazing this is. He goes straight to the healthcare profession to say this is why they were struggling so much. So we see that there are certain things that are really important to Thucydides from the very beginning when he's explaining what happened. And you can see in that second passage that I highlighted in blue, he says the more they came into contact with sufferers, the more liable they were to lose their own lives. And this is, of course, very true of what's going on with coronavirus now, right? We know that the more you're exposed, the worse case you get. We know that healthcare providers have had insufficient PPE, that they've been dying in far greater numbers than they have any right to. So we can see that there is this concern from the very beginning about doctors on the front line, healthcare providers on the front line. And he talks also about where the plague comes from. The plague is said to have come first from Ethiopia, beyond Egypt, so some exotic, faraway place. And there's this fear, there's this conspiracy theory that the plague actually came from the Peloponnesians, the Spartans, who would put poison in the well. So this idea of there's no natural explanation for it. It must be the malice of human beings. And then he says, when it came to the upper city, the death count really took off. So he's tracking even the progress geographically, not just in terms of the body count, but how it moved from the outside of the city, Piraeus, the harbor, up into the city itself. So he's really, there's certain things that we see going on again and again. So I'm going to give you a couple. This page is going to look really, really print dense, so I apologize, but it's also very colorful, so a little mercy. So here we go. In terms of cure, there was not a single remedy, you might say, which ought to be applied to give relief, right? So there's this concern, how do we cure it? There's also no kind of constitution, strong or weak, proved sufficient, that there was no pattern to how people died. There was no pattern to understanding who lived. So we see, and I'm moving progressively through his description so you can see the things that were really important to him in the order that he put them. Then he moves on to society and he says, once the plague kicked in, the beginning of a decline to greater lawlessness in the city, that as all of the other kinds of order broke down, the order that human beings put on themselves began to break down. People lost the will to cohere as a people, to look after each other, to belong to each other. And he talks about, for example, one group of people who responded by saying, whatever's pleasant to me now, what was pleasant in the short term, that's now honorable and useful, right? I want it now. I might die tomorrow, so by golly, I'm gonna eat this thing or drink this thing or go to the beach or not wear a mask or whatever it is. And so he says at the end, no fear of the gods or law of men had any restraining power, that the sort of the chaos that the natural world had wrecked made chaos in the human world. And what did that mean for the nation overall? It meant that they had fallen into the great misfortune and were being ground down by it. So all of these individual choices become a national crisis. So we see how he's moved from this is how it got here, this is what happened to people, to this is what happened to the society in this way, to a larger picture of it. So that's the shape of his narrative. Those are the things that he's worried about. So what about the Black Plague, which comes along in the 14th century? And if you want a really, really good account of the Black Plague for something really cheerful to read, can I recommend Barbara Tuchman's A Distant Mirror, which is all about the Black Plague in the 14th century. It's really, really good. But Boccaccio was a guy in his 30s living in Florence when the plague hit in 1348. And in 1350, he wrote the Decameron, which is very much like Canterbury Tales. It's a bunch of people who escape Florence and the plague. They go live in a country house and they tell each other stories to pass the time. So what does he say? He says a lot of things that might sound familiar. When did it hit? Where did it hit? And where did it come from? It had its origin some years before in the East. It had spread into the West. So again, right from the beginning, this origin concern, where did it come from? And that it comes from the East, right? It's their fault. And then there's the description, right? It resists cure, right? Set entirely at naught the art of the physician and the virtues of physic. That's anything any good medicine can do. So there's no cure for it. There's nothing anybody can do. And then he talks about all the quacks who pop up, right? The multitude of men and women who practice without having received the slightest tincture of medical science. For this, we can thank the internet, right? You know, all the exhortations to take colloidal silver. And by the way, don't take colloidal silver. There's absolutely nothing good about drinking your candlesticks, basically. So don't do that. And what does he do? He says, the virulence of the past was greater by reason that intercourse was apt to convey it from the sick to the whole. So here's this transmission concern we saw in Thucydides. He talks about even touching the clothes or something that somebody touched can get you sick. So again, this sort of everything in the world puts you in peril, this real concern. So how does society respond? So his next set of concerns, having established where it came from and what it did to people, is what it does to society. So one group of people actually put themselves in quarantine. They get together, they make their little quarantine pods, their plague pods, they go off someplace and they sort of live quietly and try to keep away from it. The next group of people basically say, I'm not going to bother with this. If I want to have fun, I'm going to have fun. I'm going to drink freely. I'm going to go to places of public resort, like, I don't know, the beach or a dance party. I'm going to eat what I want and make fun of people who are worried about it. And I'm just going to have a good time. And that's the second group. But then Boccaccio has a third group, people who find a middle way. People who live with a degree of freedom sufficient to satisfy their appetites, but not as recluses, right? So these are people who find a way to sort of balance staying away from everybody, but behaving like maniacs. And he also talks about how they protect themselves, that when they go out, they protect themselves. Now they're thinking of themselves, I don't want to get sick myself, but nevertheless, right, there's this idea of doing something, of taking some action to protect yourself. So these are things we see in common with Thucydides, or maybe introducing a new element here or there. And I want to jump forward to Daniel Defoe's Journal of the Plague Year. Now, plague hit London fairly intermittently for hundreds of years until it was finally eradicated. In comparison, if you lived in London, you could expect a smallpox epidemic every 3 to 5 years. Pretty much. So that sort of gives you a comparison. And smallpox, plague had about a 50% mortality rate. Smallpox had a 30% mortality rate. So you're really like, this is not like our time at all. But in 1722, he publishes this retrospective Journal of the Plague Year. So why 1722? Because the plague is coming back in 1722. They're watching it come across Europe and getting ready to come to England. They can track it. They know that it's coming. And so he writes Journal of the Plague Year to remind people what it was like, what they did that was good, what they did that was idiotic, what the experience was like. So he's already looking back. He's taking that device of looking back and saying, what can we learn? What can we know from this past experience? And he's got a lot in common, right? He's got this idea that it's totally inexplicable, that it's a level of horror, that it's beyond description, right? He's got a lot of the particulars in common. His plague also comes from the East. It also is inflicted on them no matter what they do. He starts with where it comes from. He goes on to a list of symptoms. He talks about how the physicians can't do anything about it. He talks about the struggle to maintain civil order and how people go crazy. He talks about how people are ordered into quarantine. This is the city government responding to the plague. And they say, if you've got plague in your family, you have to lock yourself up. They hire police to make sure that people don't come out of their homes. People don't like it. He talks about how people resist quarantine, how they try to pay off the police or they sneak out their back windows. People do all sorts of completely bonkers thing, like they walk around with a piece of paper with random letters written on it because they think that will cure them. So he's got a whole bunch of things that are very much in common with all of these other accounts. Did he read Boccaccio? Maybe. Did he read Thucydides? Really, maybe. Well, did Boccaccio read Thucydides? Probably not. So what we've got then is a series of narratives that have all of these things in common that didn't necessarily feed on each other. So you can see with him that he plots the progress of the plague street to street. So it starts at number 3, where the blue arrow is St. Giles in the Fields. And he talks about how people are watching the bills of mortality. They're watching the deaths every week, and they can see what street people are dying on. So they're watching it come towards them as it comes across London. And this is, he's plotting it in great detail with data, with maps, with details, all of this sort of thing. And these are some scenes from contemporary accounts. So in the top right, number 3, you can see the people are living in the Thames on boats to avoid being contaminated. In the middle, number 5, you can see people carrying coffins in just a steady stream to the cemeteries. In number 6 and number 7, you can see mass graves of people being buried. So this is what life was like in London, and they're trying to record it, trying to make sense of it. So where does this bring us? Hopefully at this point, you've begun to sort of say, oh yeah, this sounds pretty familiar to me, right? We have this insistence that it came from the East. So technically it did, right? The novel coronavirus did originate in China, but there's really not a nuance in the story that the East Coast novel coronavirus was a mutated form that came to us from Europe. The West Coast coronavirus is the one that came in its original form from China. So we really don't tell that story. We keep saying that it's from the East, it's from China. It also has these mysterious origins. Did it come from the woods? Did it come from a lab? Is it brand new? Do we know about coronaviruses? Do we know anything? Do we know nothing? You can see that there's this concern that other humans did this to us, right? The Peloponnesians poisoned the well, the Chinese did something terrible to the West. This struggle to find treatments, this ongoing concern, tracking, how does this work? The insufficiency of the medical profession, not for lack of trying, the incredible horror at the body count. Lots of people behaving badly, story after story after story about people sort of saying, I don't care if I die. Right, a real struggle to maintain civil order, people invading state houses with, AK-47s and refusing to wear masks, sheriffs refusing to enforce mask laws in Texas, right, this incredible overwhelming of all of the systems by the body count, right, that there are refrigerated trucks at hospitals to hold the bodies because there's just no place for the society to put them. There's an overwhelming of our systems. A huge importance on quarantine, right? And then this geographical watching a disease advance. And if you've been looking like at the New York Times, I think the Washington Post has this, CNN has this, there are trackers that will show you. You can go online and you can watch how the disease has moved over time, how the rates have changed in different counties or countries. So there's a real concern with this. These are all things that we see over and over and over again. So in aspects of the stories, we've got these recurring characteristics. We tell plague stories in certain ways. There are concerns across narratives, even if these authors didn't know each other, even if the disease they're experiencing isn't the same. Even when they know what the disease is, they've had the Black Death in their world before. They cope with it in the same ways. And then we've got what? We've got a recurring set of methods for making some kind of meaning out of this terrifying, chaotic, almost incomprehensible situation. So that's what we can find out about the stories. What does that say about us? Well, we can say that at least for Westerners, certain human responses we share these, that they will come up again and again and again in a similar situation when it's plague, right, pandemic or epidemic, that the way we talk about these experiences have certain commonalities too, that we have methods of expressing ourselves that are shared, and that therefore we should be really conscious of what we do and how we talk about these things, the words that we use, right? Because this is how we make sense of them. And in particular, I want you to think about that origin story that I mentioned, right? That what do you call it? The slurs, the kung fu, the Wuhan virus, as opposed to the novel coronavirus, or the fact that that people think that because it's called COVID-19, it's because it's the 19th one. It's not the 19th one. It was discovered in 2019. It takes the time of the year, but there's like that not understanding of what it is. So we've got from our past this understanding that we are continuing to carry forward, and we can understand ourselves and understand the things that we fall back on by looking at these past stories, by looking at the way we've understood them and made sense of them. So let's get a little bit closer to hand in terms of how do we actually deal with this sort of thing. So part two, what's actually here that we're dealing with, or what's not actually here that we're dealing with. So let's talk about public health, and what do I mean by that when I talk about public health? And what I mean is, one, a system in which the health of the public is advanced and protected. And that this is a system that applies to everybody, that it is run by public institutions, and it is for the public good. But I'm also talking about sort of an ethos, right? An idea that public health is important, that it is part of the nation, part of who we are, and part of what we do. So when we talk about public health, or when I talk about public health, I'm not just talking about like the FDA, I'm talking about a set of beliefs that says having an FDA is really important. Right? Okay, so a couple facts to kick off this conversation. Every developed country except the United States has some version of this, right? And pay attention to this quote from Dylan Scott, who wrote this in January before everything really got bad, right? He said, "It's not a question of politics, it's a question of morality. Everybody should be covered. The politics starts there. Then it's a question of how should everybody be covered." He says, but bear in mind that everybody should be covered is not a political issue. So we're talking then about a social belief, not a political tenet. To give you an example of the costs, let's talk maternal mortality rate in the United States. It's gone up 56% in 20 years, less actually, that's statistics for I think 2019, and it's nearly tripled since 1987. At the same time that medicine has gotten better, maternal mortality rate in the United States has gotten worse. So as a comparison, just take a look. There are a lot of countries that are way ahead of us, but Albania is better than us. Instead of 19 deaths per 100,000 people, it's 15. Croatia has 8. Turkmenistan has 7. We are talking about emerging countries here that have far better maternal mortality rates than the United States. So this is a real gauge for us of how well we're doing protecting our citizens, in particular, in this case, women. And by the way, it's far worse if you're a woman of color, far, far worse. So another statistic, out of 195 countries, 174 of them do better in making sure that their people get access to healthcare. 174 countries. So our people are way down in access to healthcare. And just as a side note, hey, look, we're 87th for immunization. We suck there too. So just sort of as a side note, this is not necessarily unrelated. If you go back and you look at those statistics, who's ahead of us? Serbia, Slovakia, Macedonia. And if you want to talk people who we are so far behind in terms of the population health, right? Overall, Slovenia, Cyprus, and Estonia are so far ahead of us. They're not even visible, basically. They're doing so much better than we are. So our general population, despite our being a developed nation, is sicker than emerging nations by a lot. And we deny easy access to healthcare to a huge proportion of our population. So when we talk about public health, we're not just talking about access, right? We're talking about whether there's any kind of national mandate or concern about this. And the answer is, it's not political, right? Every president, with the exception of Eisenhower and Reagan, has proposed some form of public health care, a system. So FDR put it out in 35, he floated the idea. And until the ACA was passed, it had been every president since then. So we're talking almost a century of presidents across the political spectrum saying we really need to do something for our people. And by the way, just as a note, Namibia, Gabon, Romania, and Timor-Leste join Serbia, Slovakia, Macedonia, Slovenia, Cyprus, Estonia, et cetera, for countries that already have universal healthcare and are doing better than we are, right? So when you think about the United States in comparison with, say, Gabon, just bear in mind that we may have more Wi-Fi access, but their people have better healthcare than we do. So why? Well, I hate to say it because the 18th century is my favorite century, but it's because of the 18th century. It's what we have inherited from the 18th century. And what we've inherited is this idea from the scientific revolution that medication is a commodity. We didn't always think of it as something that had to be bought and sold. We also inherited this idea of capitalism, that it should be allowed to roam free. Adam Smith in 1775, I think it is, with Wealth of Nations, is simply saying out loud something that people had believed for a very long time about emerging capitalism. We also have this worship of private property. If you go and you look at, say, John Locke, his theories of government, if you look at Rousseau, who's writing his theories of government in the 1770s, you see this emphasis that government is about private property. It's not about civilian welfare, right? It's about private property. It's very different, by the way, from Thomas Hobbes, who said, you know, life would be nasty, brutish, and short if we didn't have government. This is, government exists so that you get to keep what you have. And the last big idea from the 18th century is that America is just super wonderful and not like anybody else. And you can see this articulated, you know, kind of everywhere. The fact that we thought that it was okay to enslave people is sort of like a marvelous and horrific example of this. And to give you some examples of places where we have enshrined these ideas, the Declaration of Independence, the Bill of Rights, the early amendments, all of them emphasize the right of the American individual to have their property. This is about property. Now, this isn't the only thing that they're talking about, and I'm not opposed to private property, don't get me wrong, but the primacy of this idea is something that we've inherited, and it is part of why we have this idea of public health in our country. So this raises the question, so who do we want to be? Right? Do we want to keep being these people? So Kristen Iverson, writing back in, I think this is right after Bernie Sanders withdrew from the race for the presidential nomination, said basically, if you put the individual over everybody, then you are ultimately going to have a society that falls apart. Right? And what you have from Zoe Williams, who's writing at the beginning of the pandemic, is about England and the National Health Service. England and the United States had the same system until 1948, when England put in the National Health Service. And they put in the National Health Service because, as Zoe Williams said, they got to the end of World War II and they said, well, we've put so much energy into killing people. Is that who we want to be? You know, do we want to be a country that puts our energy into killing people, or do we want to put our energy into being a country that takes care of our people? And the answer for them was a principle, an idea, a value. This is who we want to be. This is what the government should do. Regardless of where you are in the political spectrum, this is a value. So when we talk about it in terms of conservative, progressive, Republican, Democrat, bear in mind, it's not a political issue inevitably, that it is a concept that we have brought in from the 18th century that we're still holding on to. This raises the question, why is medication more like tea and less like water? So we don't have a public health infrastructure because that's not the way we value things. We don't value the nation in terms of the nation. We value the nation as an aggregate of private property holders. And so we're going to see our obligations to them and to each other very differently. Okay, So why is medication more like tea and less like water? Well, hopefully this scene is not literally familiar to you, but this is the Boston Tea Party from a contemporary rendering of it. And you can see on the right, you have the colonists who are dressed up and they're dumping the tea, which looks a little bit like packing peanuts into the ocean. You can see people on the quay, absolutely delighted, cheering, really thrilled. So this is the Boston Tea Party. So what was the Boston Tea Party about? It's about the high price of tea, right? They were saying, listen, we don't have a problem paying for tea. Fine, you can charge us for tea, but it's not fair to make it so expensive that we can't actually afford it. That's not right. It's okay that it's a commodity, but you can't price it out of our reach. So there's the acceptance of tea as something that's a good in terms of a hat or gloves or a horse. And so they're willing to accept that. So what does that mean? Medication is more like tea because you have to buy it, that you have to get it from a very particular person, whether they make it or they import the pieces from China and then they put it together, or whether they make those parts themselves. That medication is like tea because there's a market for it, and the market means that there are competitors trying to sell it, trying to dominate each other. It's more like tea because if you don't have the money, you can't have it, right? Too bad for you. Sorry, that Darjeeling, you're gonna have to do without, baby. And the whole purpose, or not the whole purpose, but a huge part of the purpose of selling it is for money. It's not to get healthcare to people. It's not to get medication to people. It's to make money. So that's how medication in the United States is like tea. Well, what about water? It's not like water because everybody's entitled to access to water. We have that understanding here in the United States. And although we say that the government's job is to ensure that access to water, okay, we also say that it's to ensure good access, water, good water. We don't really ask the government to make sure that we can get access to medication. And we're not really emphatic about making sure that the government patrols private corporations. There are plenty of times when we blink and we say, okay, well, you know, that was a petition or that got on the market too soon or something. And why didn't the FDA catch it? But there's not that level of outrage, right? So we're a little mushy on that. And furthermore, and this is my last point that I really want to emphasize, if you have water and you are standing next to somebody who doesn't have it and is dying, if you don't give it to them, that's a criminal offense, right? You don't stand next to somebody dying of thirst and say, well, that'll be $100, please. Oh, you don't have it, sorry. If you can save somebody's life and you deliberately choose not to, that's not okay. But you can do that with medication in this country. So how did we get there? Well, once upon a time, there wasn't a scientific revolution, and the way we got medicine was from women. And let me just stop now and say, these are not those witches and crones and, you know, burned at the stake, okay? No, that is a story that people told later on. But if you look at the reasons why women were burned at the stake, they were usually because these were very difficult women in their community who had engendered a lot of animosity, and not because they burned lizards' feet in the dark or things like that. So it was usually a very personal vendetta, and accusing women of witchcraft was a very handy way of getting troublemakers out of the way. So in the beginning, as in before the scientific revolution, making medicine was like darning socks. This was something that women did, and you did it at home. And it was free, this knowledge, that you wrote it down, you shared it with your friends, you shared it with your family, you trained the next generation. It was it was contrary to purposes to keep it a secret. Your whole job, in fact, was to make sure that other people knew it. And that meant that illness was a community thing, that if you didn't have a cure at home that was helping somebody, you could go to somebody else. And they would say, yeah, I've got something for worms. I've got something for that mysterious itch. I've got something for jaundice or miscarriage or whatever that is. So medication was a community endeavor. It was free, it was open, and it was part of what you lived with, like darning socks and washing. Even washing, yes. So the pictures that I've included are of a 17th century recipe book that I had the privilege to look at when I was in England. And if you were at my talk about about going to the archives when I spoke in February, then some of this will look familiar, and you can see in the bottom picture, look, there's a snake, and there's the beanbag rest that you put the book on. And this is Alice Cofield's book from 1649, and she wrote down the recipes. She wrote down recipes for cake and how to poach a fish, and she wrote down recipes for a good burn salve and all of that sort of thing, and it would be passed on. That was the whole idea. But then that changed. Right? So what did they do? They did a couple things. One, they changed all the cultural associations of medication from women to men. They established the prescription system. They made science superior to everything. Ooh, science, cool. And they used chemistry and to sort of set medication aside and to make it something separate from the home, separate from ordinary life. And so the picture over here, again, you can see the little snake weights. This is a prescription book from James Douglas from 1725. So it's almost 200 years, 300 years old at this point. And you can see that it's very different from that recipe book, right? If you look at the recipe book, it's written in words. This is symbols and Latin and wonky things. So what happened with recipe books? Women wrote down recipes, and they shared their recipe books. They wrote in each other's books. They handed them down to the next generation. What men did in the middle of the 17th century was they started taking the recipe books of dead women and printing them and saying, well, this dead woman had these recipes, but they started taking credit for it. And so they switched over through using print this idea that medication and recipes was something that women wrote about, and they changed it over so that it became something that men wrote about. They established the prescription system so that the best medication came when you went to a physician, paid him for a prescription, and then you took that prescription to an apothecary and paid him for the medication. And that was a very closed system. If you weren't licensed to write a prescription, you couldn't. If you weren't licensed as an apothecary, you weren't supposed to be making medicine either. And this is an example of different prescriptions. On the left, you can see the ophthalmia. This is a list of the prescriptions the doctor tried to help his patient. He tried one prescription, then another, then another. In the middle is more James Douglas. And then on the right, just because I thought this was really nifty, James Douglas kept records of his prescriptions, and he bound them together with a pin. And so that is the original 300-year-old pin that James Douglas used, and I just thought that was cool. So speaking of cool, science is cool, man. And the men who do science, they're super cool too. So on the right, that's a picture of a lab notebook. Men trying to figure out what made medicinal things medicinal. And by the way, medicine didn't get any better until the 19th century. So all of this cool, nifty science stuff didn't actually make anything better. So what they did was they put out this idea that science is real knowledge, that science takes special training, not just anybody can do it. It requires special equipment. So even though it looks like that still just came from your wife in the kitchen, no. This is a special chemistry still. It's not at all the still that you borrowed from your wife. And those tongs that you thought you might have seen and used in the kitchen, these are special chemistry tongs, not the same, right? It is done in a special space. You don't make medicine in the kitchen. Science is done in special places where, of course, women can't go. And it requires certain characteristics. You need to be logical and objective, and women, of course, are not logical and objective. And so this is how they gendered science male, and they made it something really, really special. And as for the sharing thing, absolutely not. Science was special knowledge, medication was special knowledge, and for God's sake, you did not share it. The thought was heresy, right? So all very, very different. This should sound really familiar. Science is male. Well, sure, if you take a look, what are we living with? A huge gender imbalance in STEM fields. And in fact, science didn't start testing drugs on women until the 1990s. And my favorite example of this is a breast cancer study that was done, I think, in the early 1990s that was done only on men. It was like 3,000 men to study breast cancer. And it's sort of like, you didn't think maybe you should use women for this since that's who it hits? And the authors were like, no, So it's sort of a great example and a horrible one. Also, this idea that prescription drugs are superior, that the physicians and apothecaries put in the 18th century, sure, of course. What have we got? We've got the patent system now that that this is knowledge that needs to be protected and cared for. And of course, pharmaceutical companies have this hugely adversarial relationship with generics corporations because their drugs are better than the generic. And the idea that doctors and drug makers work together, right? This prescription system, sure. What have we got? We've got the opioid crisis. And by the way, it's not the first one. Physicians and drug makers have been doping up people for centuries. The laudanum scandal of the end of the 19th century was just the first of many, not even the first, I think. And by the way, it keeps going, right? And you're probably saying, oh yeah, medication is a commodity. You've got to pay for it. Where have I seen that before? Pretty much everywhere, right? The medication crisis in the United States, the criminal code. 34 million people in 2019 knew somebody who had died because they couldn't pay for their medication. 34 million people knew somebody. 1/4 of diabetics in the United States have to ration their insulin because they cannot pay for enough doses for themselves. And 1/3 of American women at some point before in 2019 couldn't pay for a prescription. So we're talking about a really serious problem by making medication something that you buy and sell. It's a system about control and profit, which means that the FDA regulations are supposed to protect the consumer, but they actually regulate a system that isn't always in the consumer's favor. See above criminal code. And also, if you're interested, go take a look at Katie Porter, Representative Katie Porter, grilling Dr. Robert Redfield on who should pay for COVID testing. Because in the beginning, you probably remember the government wouldn't pay for it. And she ran the numbers and she said, here's why the government has to pay for it. And she got him to commit to say that he would. By the way, later in the day, he then said he hadn't really said what he said, and the White House tried to keep that from happening. But why? Because the testing companies make a fortune from that, right? And the government doesn't want to spend its money on it. This is what the individual should be doing. And what are we living with? We're living with this idea that science is special and special people do it. What has happened? We live in a country where there is a tremendous alienation from science, a huge hostility towards it, ignorance about how science works. Similarly with education, bewildering hostility. People don't understand that science doesn't always establish facts, that sometimes there's not enough information. And what have you got? Then you've got these crazy cult people. Oh, I beg your pardon, I shouldn't talk about it like that. You have these people who are anti-vaxxers who refuse to wear masks because they refuse to accept the science because they do not understand how it works, right? So this is all the legacy of the 18th century. This is everything that was brought in during the 18th century that has sort of ripened and developed. So I know I told you that this talk only has 3 parts, but it doesn't. It really has 4. So what should we think about? Well, there's that saying that those who forget history are doomed to repeat it. So what about the people who remember history? What are we doomed to do? So what I would propose to you is that when you know that you are the inheritor of the past, when you see what the past has given you, this gives you a different understanding of who you are, right? You understand that these things are not immutable. You understand that these things are not inevitable, that medication as a commodity is not gravity, it's an idea, right? And I'm also proposing that we think about how do you make things different? If you make things different by changing who pays for something, you still haven't changed the idea that medication needs to be paid for. And I'm sort of harping on this one, but you could pick any of these ideas, right? Just like I'm not opposed to private property, I'm also not opposed to capitalism in the abstract, right? Okay. But I'm saying we need to be aware. We need to be very conscious of what we're using it to do and why it is or isn't a choice for us. So if we started at this moment during the pandemic to say, well, what do we believe? And maybe think about whether those beliefs are acceptable, that it's not a political issue, whether everybody in the country. Then we start changing the conversation rather profoundly. And we take it away from red and blue. So I'm going to come to a stop here. I've gone on rather a long time, hopefully with some good pictures, but I just want to say again, thank you.
Oh my God, you were phenomenal. You
And
were
of course,
so
stay
fast.
safe. And if there are questions, I am so excited to take them.
Okay. Michael, can I just say something to Karen?
Sure.
Karen?
You can be heard, Phyllis.
Yes,
Oh, I didn't know I
we
was
can
heard.
hear you.
You were so exceptional, so fascinating, and
Thank you.
everything you said has so much
Thank you.
meaning in today's world. And I know I heard your other talks, but I'm telling you, you were like, you could have been a great politician because you convinced me totally. But all through the years, you have to tell people that that right now you teach a course in Seton Hall on illness and
Literature, illness and literature, yeah.
so you have all these, because I asked you yesterday, I said, where did you get these facts? Everything you said was so true.
Thank you.
And it's very frightening because change takes such a long time, so that my thought is, how do we make it faster? What do we do? I know you gave a suggestion.
I'm a little, having railed against medication as a commodity and said some rude things about John Locke, I'm now a little bit cautious about advocating profound social upheaval. But I think there's a conversation happening already, out there, and I think it's well worth keeping the conversation going, and just refusing to consider it as a political issue, refusing to say, well, if you're a Democrat or if you're a Republican, because it's not, right? It's a question of what do you believe? Do you believe that medication should be bought and sold and that it's okay that people die if they can't pay for it? Now, okay, so if that's your belief, fine. But you should be aware that that's what you're protecting. Oh, sorry about the fingernails. My daughter got hold of me. So mother-daughter bonding. Hers are yellow too, if anybody wants to know. So I think just making people aware so that when we have the conversation to say, if that's what you're advocating, then what you're saying you believe is X. And so just keep taking the conversation back to why is it that way? Why do we treat it that way? Why is it not a crime for pharmaceutical companies to know that people are dying and not do anything about it? Clearly, I think that's horrific.
I ask you, years ago, growing up on television, you did not see pharmaceutical companies.
No, there was a change in legislation that made that permissible.
I was just going to say, now every other commercial is a long pharmaceutical.
Yeah. Right. And that line, ask your doctor about, is a really crucial one for them. That's part of how they put pressure on physicians to prescribe their medication. Yeah, but it was a legislative change that made that possible.
And who was responsible for that?
I believe Congress authorized the FCC.
Wow. Okay, I was wondering about that. And I was wondering, I have one other question, and then I'll give it over. I just have to ask you, we were talking about this on Wednesday at a creative writing group about who should be if people choose not to be vaccinated with the coronavirus vaccine,
right. Mm-hmm.
Will they have an option, or will it be mandatory?
Yeah, so I debate this with my students in my illness and literature class. What I do is I have them read about Typhoid Mary, and we talk about whether she should have basically had her, whether it was okay to seize her and lock her up, basically. That she knew, or she had been told that she was highly contagious, that she was in effect killing people by going around, and that she really she kept doing what she was doing. Now, on the other hand, Typhoid Mary would say, that's fine, except I need to eat. Like this is how I make money. I'm a cook. So we debate that. We debate about whether it's okay to basically sort of suspend habeas corpus or suspend people's right to control what happens to their body if it's for the public good. you know, I think about, for example, the fluoridation of drinking water. I think about the polio vaccine, right? Where there was not a whole lot of public discussion about this. Your kids were lined up, and I'm talking to people who were, and you got that vaccine in school, right? Like, you know, there's the lines of people and boom, 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 boom.
Yes.
And it really wasn't a discussion. And so why not? And I think this does have to be a discussion, but I think it needs to be an outright discussion, right? Which is something actually that Plato wrote, of all things, where he said, look, if you want to live in a country and benefit from the country, then you also have to be prepared to do something for that country in return. So if you want running water, a police force, public schools, a fire department, you know, your garbage taken away, if you want all of those things, great. But you have to do something in return. And so that something might be getting vaccinated. In Socrates' case, it meant drinking hemlock and dying, which I think that might be going a bit far. But right, but that is a conversation that's really antithetical to American exceptionalism, because it's about what do you owe the state, right? Not what. Right, ask not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country. And it's a conversation about not having your individual rights be paramount, but about being part of a community and being obligated to the community. So I don't want to go on the record as saying I think everybody should basically be forced to have a vaccine, but I will tell you the thought that somebody could go around killing people because they refuse to is a painful thought for me.
Thank you.
I don't know if anybody else is allowed to ask questions, but I'm happy to take any.
They are mostly unmuted, so this is
Okay.
Melissa. And so anybody who wants to speak up, speak now or forever hold your peace.
So much for what? Hello, this is
Hi.
Nancy.
Hi.
Hi.
I'm speaking up to
I wanted
say,
to thank Phil. Hello.
Hello.
Yes, Sandy, we hear you.
Hi. This
Hi,
is
Sandy.
Sandy. I wanted to thank Phyllis for a wonderful conversation. I've seen this, Karen.
Yay, Phyllis, second the motion.
Thank you. I
Well,
wish everybody a
thank
good
you.
week and be safe and well. Thank you.
I
Thank
have a
you.
question
Thank you.
also. So what do we do with those in our society who do refuse to take a vaccine like the coronavirus vaccine? What recourse do we have as the common, quote unquote, for the common good to mitigate that situation or reverse it in some way?
So again, I'm not really a policy wonk. I'm just an academic. So my job is to get everybody to think differently, and then I say, go forth and make trouble, or as the late John Lewis would say, make good trouble. So if you were asking me what I would do, and that's pretty much all I can advocate, what I would say is this is a conversation that has to take place on a large level, right? This can't be one person yelling at another, you have to get a vaccine. This has to be a society, a social conversation. So I think it needs to happen in Congress. People need to be talking to their representatives and saying, I want you to have this conversation about, and don't talk about it in terms of individual rights. Talk about it in terms of the community's right. And talk about it in terms of not whether somebody is entitled to protect themselves, but whether the state is entitled to keep somebody from harming somebody else, right? Like, we have a speed limit. There's a reason for that. You're not allowed to drive with a certain level of alcohol in your blood. We have a reason for that. You're not allowed to vote until there's a certain age. We have a reason for that, right? So that's that we need to be pushing the politicians to overtly have that conversation and put it that way and say, this isn't a conversation about whether you have the right to refuse. This is a conversation about whether the state has the right to protect its citizens. And that would be, something that I would recommend. And frankly, I would really encourage the press to start having that conversation that way too, and not say, why do the anti-vaxxers refuse science, but to put it in terms of, how will this society survive if we permit this to continue, right? So I think it needs to be framed in those very stark terms. You know, I'm a college professor, and you may have noticed that there's a large call for people to go back to the classroom. And the conversation is very much about, are we keeping students safe? And listen, I'm all in favor of keeping students safe. I am the mother of 2, and see, I will even paint my fingernails yellow. So I really believe in this. But there also needs to be a very frank acknowledgement that when we ask teachers to go back, we're asking them to make a decision about how much are they prepared to do in exchange for this. And, you know, my university is saying to me, if you don't go back to work, we will close. And so my answer, and I said this actually because I'm a rabble rouser, and I said this in a town meeting, was, what you're really asking me to do is to put the university's well-being above my potential well-being and my family's potential well-being. And so you're really asking me to answer the question, am I prepared to die for this institution, with a yes? And you're assuming that a good person would only answer that question by saying, yes, I am prepared to die so this university can continue. And I think we really need to be talking about that sort of thing in that sort of way. What is the value that you're really putting out here, right? When you frame the argument this way, what are you really asking? So if, as a New York Times letter writer wrote in, teachers, do your civic duty. If doctors are going to work, then you should be going to work too. Then if that's how we're going to answer it, then we need to say teaching now is explicitly that we expect teachers to take a bullet for their students, which we do, we just don't admit that, and say explicitly, and we expect you to be prepared to have permanent organ damage, to have brain damage, to die, or to bring that home to your families, right?
Karen?
Shirley, go ahead.
Okay, thank you, Melissa. A couple of things that occur to me. You talked about speed limits, and then we all know that we now have to have seatbelts. That's one of the things we do. In most school systems, I too was a teacher, a child had to be vaccinated. I mean, that was one way to protect the community. And if you weren't going to get a vaccination, of course, there are some people who don't believe in it, but the people who got the wrong information, that's a whole other thing. But I am thinking about how much we're learning about how we began to exist with 16, 19. Did we really ever think of all these things? And now the way you presented property being the basis for this republic, and may it last. And so it just makes me think that education, that's where we're at. We have to understand, hey, maybe public health is what we really, really need now. So it's just your kind of talk and our kind of willingness to think about it and accept it and act upon it.
A lot of change happens, you know, quote, around the water cooler, right? You know, you're talking casually to somebody, and you hear somebody say something, and you go, actually, you know what? Let's just talk about that for a minute. You know, it reminds me of during the Kavanaugh hearings last fall, which seems like it was 12 years ago. I was having dinner with a friend of mine who said that she didn't believe Christine Blasey Ford. She believed Kavanaugh. She thought that Ford was making everything up. And I said, you know, I understood that she felt this way and why. And she said, I just have a feeling. And I said to her, I have almost every year, almost every semester, I have a woman student who has been assaulted, sexually assaulted. And I talk to them, and their reaction looks like her reaction. And so my data set from experience of talking to these people who have that experience is that it's consistent, right? And so it was not an unpleasant conversation. And I didn't say, what was in my heart, which was, you're a blithering idiot. And I really, she's a friend of mine, I adore her. And I understand why people respond that way. I do. But I really wanted her at that moment to go, oh, you have experience talking to sexual assault survivors. Well, that beats my intuition any day, right? So I really would have liked that. The best thing that I could do was just call her on it, right? And say, I have some experience with this. And I can tell you that this is when my women students come to me and they've been raped or assaulted, and they don't want to tell me that it happened, but they need something from me. This is what it looks like.
Young kids.
So a lot happens in those conversations. There's a lot of power in just a regular conversation, a non-judgmental conversation.
Wow. We have so much to think about because of this discussion. I'm not
sorry. Now for a little light entertainment.
Listen, I'd love to take your classes because you are fascinating. So thank you. Oh,
thank you. Thank you all very much for signing on. I really appreciate it.
And you'll come back in the fall.
I will come back in person or virtually, whatever we're doing. It will depend a little bit on what's going on with my classes, of course, but yes, definitely.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Thanks very much. It's nice to see all of you again.
Thank you, Melissa.
Everybody be well. Please be well.
Thank you.
You too.